The carriage wheels crunched on gravel, a sound like bones breaking in the profound quiet, through the misty rain streaking the window. Ashworth Manor rose from the landscape not as a home but as a scar. Towers of gray stone clawed at a bruised sky, their windows dark and watchful like the eyes of a predator. Eleanor Vance felt her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, grow cold. She had seen grand houses before, but this one did not welcome. It warned. As the carriage shuddered to a halt, the driver did not speak, simply opened the door and gestured towards the colossal oak entrance. The air was damp and smelled of wet earth and stone. A chill went through Eleanor's practical wool coat that had nothing to do with the weather. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of her own making. She needed this position. The letters from her creditors were a constant, nagging ache in the back of her mind. But standing before this monument to sorrow, she felt a different kind of desperation take root, the fear of failure. The door swung open before she could reach it, revealing a woman who seemed carved from the same stern stone as the manor. Her graying hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. Her black dress was immaculate, her posture unbending. She was a fortress in miniature. "Miss Vance," the woman stated. It was not a question. "I am Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. You are late by 7 minutes." Eleanor's pride bristled. "The roads were slick with rain, I'm afraid. My apologies." She kept her voice even, calm, refusing to be intimidated. Mrs. Gable's expression did not soften. Punctuality is a cornerstone of this household. The Duke insists upon it. She stepped back, allowing Eleanor to enter, and the great door boomed shut behind her. The sound echoed down the cavernous hall, then died, leaving a silence that was heavier than any noise. The world outside vanished. The entry hall was a cathedral of shadows. Sunlight was a distant memory here, filtered through a high, stained glass window that cast muted, jewel-toned ghosts on the marble floor. The air was still and cold, thick with the scent of beeswax and something else, something like dried flowers and forgotten time. A grand staircase swept upwards into darkness. On the wall above it, a portrait hung, a single point of vibrant life in the gloom. A woman with warm, smiling eyes and hair the color of spun gold, captured in a field of summer wildflowers. The late Duchess. Her painted story was so profound, so out of place, that it felt like an accusation. "Your duties will be confined to the East Wing," Mrs. Gable said, her voice sharp, pulling Eleanor's gaze away from the portrait. "The nursery, your personal quarters, and the small dining room adjacent. You are not to venture into the West Wing. That is the Duke's private domain. Is that understood?" "Perfectly," Eleanor replied, her eyes meeting the housekeeper's. Mrs. Gable seemed to search her face for any sign of weakness, of frivolous rebellion. "Your charge, Thomas, is 8 years old. He has not spoken in 1 year. Not since the accident." The words were delivered with the same dispassion as the house rules, but Eleanor felt a pang of raw sympathy for the silent boy. "6 governesses have come before you. The longest lasted 3 weeks. They attempted to coddle him, to fill his head with sentimental nonsense. It did not work." Eleanor's chin lifted slightly. "And what is the Duke's preferred method?" A flicker of something, perhaps approval, crossed Mrs. Gable's face. "The Duke believes the boy needs structure, discipline, a firm hand. Your schedule is outlined here." She handed Eleanor a thick sheet of paper. "Lessons from 9 until noon, a silent lunch at 12:30, supervised reading from 2 until 4, dinner at 6, bed at 8. There are to be no deviations, no games, no fanciful stories. The goal is to restore order." Eleanor looked at the rigid, unforgiving schedule. It was a blueprint for a small prison, not a childhood. "And the boy's grief?" she asked softly. Mrs. Gable's lips thinned into a severe line. "Grief is a private matter. The Duke manages his own. He expects his son to learn to do the same. Your role is not to be his friend, Miss Vance. It is to be his instructor. You are to ensure he continues his education until he is ready to be sent away to school." The cold finality of that statement settled in Eleanor's stomach like a stone. This wasn't about healing a child. It was about managing an inconvenience. She followed Mrs. Gable through the echoing corridors. their footsteps the only sound. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched them pass, their painted eyes seeming to judge her, to find her wanting. Every surface gleamed, yet the house felt profoundly unclean, tainted by a sorrow so deep it had seeped into the very walls. As they passed a heavy, partially open door, a man's voice, low and clipped, drifted out. It was a voice accustomed to command, laced with impatience. "I don't care what his references say, Jennings. She has that same look in her eye, that misguided hope. She won't last a week." Eleanor froze. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her face burned with humiliation. She glanced at Mrs. Gable, who gave a nearly imperceptible shake of her head, her expression unchanged, urging her forward. They continued down the hall, but Eleanor's mind was stuck on that single, dismissive sentence. The Duke of Ashworth, Alistair Blackwood. He had already condemned her. A hot, defiant anger surged through her, chasing away the cold fear. A week. He gave her a week. She would give him a lifetime of being wrong. Her purpose, which had been a fragile thing born of financial need, solidified into something hard and sharp. She wasn't just here for a salary anymore. She was here to fight the oppressive shadow that filled this house, the shadow that emanated from its grieving, cold-hearted master. Mrs. Gable finally stopped before a door at the end of a long, narrow corridor. "This is the nursery wing. Your room is to the left. The boys' is to the right. A maid will bring your trunk up. Dinner is in 1 hour." The housekeeper turned to leave, her duty done. "Mrs. Gable," Eleanor called out, her voice clear and steady. The woman paused. "Thank you." The housekeeper looked back, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. She gave a curt, formal nod and then disappeared into the gloom, her footsteps receding into silence. Eleanor was left alone. She pushed open the door to the nursery and stepped inside. The room was large and impeccably clean. The furniture was of the highest quality, a small desk, a sturdy bookshelf, a perfectly made bed. But it was sterile, soulless. The bookshelf held only textbooks on mathematics and grammar, their spines unbroken. There were no wooden soldiers, no colorful spinning tops, no well-loved, tattered storybooks. There was no sign that a child actually lived here. It was a room waiting for an occupant who had no joy to bring to it. And then she saw him. Across the room, standing before a tall, mullioned window that looked out onto a rain-slicked, walled garden, was a small boy. He was a slight, dark-haired figure, his back to her. His small hands were pressed flat against the cold glass. He was utterly still, a miniature statue of loss. He was watching the raindrops race each other down the pane, lost in a world she could not enter. She took a soft step into the room. The floorboard creaked. The sound was a violation in the crushing silence. Eleanor's heart ached. This was Thomas, the boy who had seen his mother fall, the boy who had sealed his voice away with the memory. He was so small, dwarfed by the grand window in the cavernous room. All the reports, all the warnings from Mrs. Gable, all the Duke's cold dismissal, none of it had prepared her for the sheer, silent weight of the child's sorrow. "Hello, Thomas," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm your new governess." He gave no sign that he had heard her. His gaze remained fixed on the world outside the window, on the gray, weeping sky and the neglected garden below. His shoulders did not move. His head did not turn. It was as if she were a ghost of air, a thing of no consequence. She stood there for a long moment, a stranger in a silent room, facing the small, unmoving back of a child who had locked the door to his soul and thrown away the key. The challenge was no longer an abstract idea. It was here, real and breathing, and it was a boy staring at the rain, pretending she did not exist. The silence of Ashworth Manor was not empty. It was a presence, heavy and thick like velvet curtains that smothered sound. It pressed in on Eleanor as she awoke to a gray, uncertain dawn on her first full day. The air in her chamber was cold enough to see her breath, a small, fleeting cloud in the gloom. Outside her window, mist clung to the ancient trees on the grounds, making the world seem distant and indistinct. The Duke's words from the previous day echoed in her mind, a cold counterpoint to the ticking of the great clock in the hall below. "She won't last a week." The phrase had settled in her heart like a shard of ice. She had heard the dismissal in his tone, the weary certainty of a man who had seen failure many times before. She dressed with deliberate care, her fingers moving surely over the buttons of her simple gray dress. Pride was her only armor in this place. She twisted her chestnut hair into a tight, practical bun, the familiar motion a small comfort against the vast unknown of the day ahead. Looking into the small mirror above the washstand, she saw her own clear gray eyes staring back. They looked tired but resolute. Failure was not an option. It was not simply a matter of employment. It was a matter of a child lost in a silent, lonely world. She would not allow that silence to defeat her. She would not become just another name on the list of governesses who had fled from the ghost-haunted halls of Ashworth. Breakfast was a solitary affair in a small, cheerless dining room. A single place was set for her at a long, polished table that could have seated 20. Mrs. Gable had appeared briefly to inform her of the schedule, her voice as starched as her apron. Lessons were to begin at 9. The nursery was prepared. The master of the house, Duke Alistair Blackwood, was not present. Eleanor had the distinct impression he was rarely present anywhere but his own private library, a fortress of solitude from which he ruled his silent kingdom. She ate the toast and drank the weak tea, the food tasteless in her mouth. The only sound was the distant, methodical tick of that clock, counting down the hours of her first day, perhaps the first of her last week. At precisely 5 minutes to 9, she stood before the nursery door. Her hand rested on the cold brass knob, her heart a nervous drum against her ribs. She took a slow, steadying breath, pushing away the image of the Duke's cold, dismissive face. This was not about him. This was about the boy. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was large and airy, with a tall window overlooking the sprawling, neglected gardens. It was immaculately clean, everything in its proper place. A row of wooden soldiers stood in a perfect, unmoving line on a shelf. A collection of leather-bound books was arranged by size, their spines unbroken. A small desk and chair stood near the window, a blank slate of paper and a sharpened pencil laid out upon it. The room was a perfect model of a nursery, but it felt entirely lifeless. It was a room waiting for a child who no longer knew how to be one. And there he was. Thomas Blackwood sat on a cushioned window seat, just as he had been the day before. He was a small, fragile-looking boy, lost in clothes that seemed a size too large. His dark hair fell over his brow, shadowing his face. He stared out at the overgrown lawns, his posture unnaturally still. He did not turn. He did not acknowledge her entrance in any way. He was a statue carved from grief. The silence in the room was different from the silence in the rest of the manor. Here it was not just an absence of noise. It was a deliberate, tightly held thing. It was Thomas's shield, his fortress, and his prison. Eleanor closed the door softly behind her, the click of the latch sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. "Good morning, Thomas," she said, her voice gentle but clear. There was no response, not a flicker of an eyelid, not a shift in his small shoulders. It was as if she had not spoken at all, as if she were a ghost in his world. She walked further into the room, her shoes making soft sounds on the polished floorboards. She remembered the advice of her previous employers, the manuals on child rearing she had studied. Engage the child. Find a common interest. Establish a routine. She tried. She knelt a few feet from him, careful not to enter his personal space too abruptly. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm to be your new governess." Silence. The boy's gaze remained fixed on a distant, tangled thicket of rose bushes in the garden below. His stillness was profound, unnerving. It was not the defiant silence of a stubborn child, but something deeper, more absolute. "It's a bit gray out this morning, isn't it?" She tried again, her voice straining for a note of casual warmth. "Perhaps the sun will come out later." Nothing. He was a ship becalmed on a windless sea, and she had no breeze to offer him. She stood and walked to the shelf of toys. She picked up one of the wooden soldiers, its red coat painted with perfect precision. "I see you have a fine army here. Are they preparing for a grand parade?" She held the soldier out, a hopeful, useless gesture. Thomas did not move. It was as if the space between them was a chasm a mile wide. The soldier felt heavy and foolish in her hand. She placed it back in line with his comrades, ensuring it was perfectly aligned. The rigid order of the room suddenly felt oppressive, a reflection of the Duke's own iron will. Discipline, order, these were the tools he believed in, and they had achieved this. A perfect, silent, heartbreaking stillness. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over Eleanor. The Duke was right. What could she possibly do here? How could she reach a child who had sealed himself so completely away from the world? Every instinct she had, every method she had learned, required some form of response, a flicker of interest, a crack into which a wedge of connection could be placed. But here, there were no cracks. The surface was smooth, seamless, and cold as glass. Her throat felt tight. She could feel the weight of Mrs. Gable's judgment, the shadow of the Duke's inevitable dismissal. 1 week, the words tolled like a funeral bell. She looked at the small, unmoving back of the boy, and in that moment her despair hardened into something else. A quiet, fierce rebellion. The Duke's methods had failed. The long line of governesses before her had failed. Forcing her way into his world was like throwing stones at a fortress wall. It would only make him retreat further. She would not do that. She would not be another voice demanding something from him, another adult trying to pry open his silence. If he would not enter her world, she would build one beside his and leave the door open. With a newfound resolve, she turned away from him. She walked to the other side of the large room to a small armchair that sat beside a cold, empty fireplace. Her movement was a declaration. She was abandoning the direct assault. She sat down, the chair sighing under her weight. From the small satchel she had brought with her, she withdrew the slim volume of poetry. It was her own, a well-worn book with softened pages, a companion through many lonely evenings. She did not look at Thomas. She did not check to see if he was watching. The success of this new strategy depended on her complete commitment to it. This was not for him. This was for her. She opened the book and found a page. Her voice, when she began to read, was not the bright, animated tone one would use for a child. It was quiet, measured, and personal. She read for herself, a low murmur filling the suffocating silence of the nursery. "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul," she began, the words of the poet a balm to her own frayed nerves. She let the rhythm of the lines carry her, focusing on the images they conjured in her own mind. A bird singing a tune without words. A storm. The enduring warmth of a small, fragile creature. The great clock in the hall chimed the half-hour. The sound was intrusive, a reminder of the world outside this strange bubble she was attempting to create. She kept reading, her voice a steady, unobtrusive thread of sound. She did not ask for his attention. She did not demand his participation. She simply offered the sound of a human voice, speaking of things that were beautiful and resilient, into the empty air. She was creating a space that was not about lessons or expectations. It was simply a space where sound, and perhaps a little bit of warmth, existed. For a long time, nothing happened. The boy remained a silhouette against the gray light of the window. Eleanor's own mind began to wander. Was this foolish? Was she simply wasting time, talking to herself in an empty room while a lost child stared at a dying garden? The Duke would scoff. Mrs. Gable would purse her lips in disapproval. Eccentric, they would call her. Ineffectual. The temptation to look at him, to search for any sign of a reaction, was immense. It was a physical ache, a need for some small validation. But she resisted. She held her gaze on the page, her fingers tracing the printed words. She had to trust this. She had to give it time. She read on, her voice growing a little stronger, a little more confident as she lost herself in the verses. She read of journeys and seasons, of light and shadow. The poems were not for children, but their themes were universal. Loss, endurance, the quiet power of nature. She chose them instinctively, letting her own heart guide her. She was not teaching him. She was simply sharing a piece of her own inner world, without asking for anything in return. The room was still silent, but it was no longer the oppressive, crushing silence from before. Her voice had woven a small tapestry of sound, hanging in the air between them. And then she saw it. It was a movement so small, so subtle, she thought at first she had imagined it. She did not see it directly, but in the faint, distorted reflection in the glass of a framed picture on the wall opposite her. Thomas had not turned his head. He had not looked at her, but he had shifted his small body on the window seat. His left shoulder, the one closest to her, was now angled slightly more into the room. His posture, which had been rigidly facing the window, had softened, leaning almost imperceptibly toward the source of the sound, towards her. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart gave a single powerful thud. It was a tiny thing, a minuscule adjustment. Anyone else would have missed it entirely. But to Eleanor, it was a seismic event. It was a crack in the ice. It was a single blade of grass pushing its way through solid stone. He was listening. He had built walls of silence around himself, but her voice had found a way to seep through, not by force, but by quiet persistence. He had not been ignoring her. He had been absorbing, processing from within his silent fortress. A fierce, protective joy surged through her, so potent it almost brought tears to her eyes. She wanted to stop, to look at him, to smile and say his name, but she knew with absolute certainty that this would shatter the delicate, fragile connection she had just forged. To acknowledge it would be to make it a performance, a demand, and he would retreat again, perhaps for good. So she did the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. She did nothing. She forced her breathing to remain even. She kept her eyes fixed on the book, and she continued to read, her voice not wavering, though her hands trembled slightly where they held the pages. She chose another poem, one about the sea, its endless motion, its deep and hidden mysteries. The words felt right. She was speaking to the deep, hidden mystery of the boy across the room. She was acknowledging the vastness of his grief without ever saying the word. The grandfather clock chimed 10. An hour had passed, an hour of speaking into a void. And the void had answered, not with a word, but with a slight turn of a shoulder. It was more than anyone had gotten from him in a year. It was a beginning. The morning wore on. She read until her voice was hoarse. She did not suggest lessons. She did not mention the untouched paper on his desk. When her throat grew too dry, she simply sat in the quiet, letting the new, less hostile silence settle around them. It was a shared silence now, not an empty one. It was populated by the echoes of poetry, by the unspoken acknowledgement that they were two people in a room together. Thomas did not move again. He remained in that slightly turned position, a silent listener. Just before noon, the nursery door creaked open. Eleanor's head snapped up, the spell broken. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway, her hands clasped before her face a mask of stern neutrality. Her sharp eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with a single comprehensive glance. She saw Eleanor in the armchair on one side of the room. She saw the untouched desk, the perfectly ordered toys, and she saw Thomas, still sitting by the window, silent as ever. She could not possibly know the significance of his posture. To her, it would look like a complete and utter failure, an hour of paid time wasted on reading poetry to the air. Eleanor's cheeks flushed. She felt a need to defend herself, to explain the tiny, monumental victory she had just witnessed. But she knew the words would sound foolish, desperate. He turned his shoulder an inch. How could that possibly stand against the Duke's demand for results? She met Mrs. Gable's gaze and held it, her chin held high. She would not be intimidated. She would not let the housekeeper's skepticism undo the fragile progress she had made. Mrs. Gable's expression was completely unreadable. There was no flicker of anger, no hint of sympathy. Her gaze lingered on Eleanor for a moment longer than was comfortable, a silent, weighty judgment. Then her eyes moved to Thomas, and for a fleeting second, Eleanor thought she saw something in the older woman's face. A flicker of something that might have been sorrow, quickly masked. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. The professional mask was back in place. Without a single word, Mrs. Gable gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if merely confirming a fact she already knew. Then she turned, and with a soft click of the door, she was gone, leaving Eleanor alone once more with the silent boy and the echo of unspoken judgment. The air in the room felt colder now, heavy with the weight of that silent observation. The heavy nursery door clicked shut, the sound echoing in the silence Mrs. Gable had left behind. Eleanor Vance did not turn to watch her go. She kept her gaze on the small boy, Thomas, who remained a statue in the center of the vast, quiet room. The housekeeper's disapproval was a cold draft that lingered long after she was gone. It was a skepticism Eleanor had felt from every corner of this house, from the polished floors to the shadowed ceilings. They were all waiting for her to fail. The Duke's dismissive words, "She won't last a week," were a constant, quiet hum beneath the silence. Eleanor slowly closed the book of poetry on her lap. Her voice, which had filled the space for the past hour, now seemed like a distant memory. For 2 days she had followed this routine. She would arrive, greet the silent child, and then settle into a chair to read aloud. She read tales of adventure, verses about the sea, and descriptions of open fields. She did not ask him questions he would not answer. She did not demand his attention. She simply offered a sound other than the ticking of the grand clock in the hall and the mournful sigh of the wind outside. Thomas had not acknowledged her, not once, but she had noticed the small things. The way his rigid little shoulders would soften almost imperceptibly when she read a particularly gentle passage. The way he, who always faced the window, had angled his body just slightly toward her chair yesterday. These were crumbs, barely anything at all, but she was starving for a sign, and she would gather them with care. Today, however, something was different. His attention was not vaguely drifting out the window. It was fixed. His small form was pressed against the cold glass, his gaze locked on a specific point below. Eleanor rose quietly and walked to a parallel window, careful not to startle him. She followed his line of sight. Below them lay the walled garden. It must have been beautiful once. She could see the ghost of it in the elegant layout of the stone paths, now almost completely lost beneath a carpet of weeds. A stone bird bath was choked with moss and black leaves. Trellises where roses once climbed were now burdened with thick, grasping ivy. The entire garden looked like a forgotten room, left to decay after its owner had departed. It was a place of deep, profound neglect, a mirror of the house itself. Yet in the center of the tangled mess, one rosebush was putting up a fight. It was gnarled and overgrown, surrounded by thistles, but it had produced 3 or 4 pale pink blossoms. They were like gasps of air from someone drowning. Eleanor watched as Thomas stared at that single point of color in the sea of green and brown. His focus was so intense it was almost painful to witness. His breath fogged a small patch on the windowpane, and he did not wipe it away. She knew the rules Mrs. Gable had laid out with chilling precision on her first day. The boy was not to be taken outside the manor walls. His routine was to be kept rigid, predictable. Nursery in the morning, luncheon, then quiet time in his room. The outdoors were deemed too chaotic, too unpredictable for a child in his delicate state. The Duke's orders. But Eleanor looked from the boy's desperate stillness to the neglected garden, and a different truth began to form in her mind. This house was a pristine tomb. The order they were so desperate to maintain was the order of a mausoleum. What Thomas needed was not more silence, more sterile predictability. He needed life. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Every morning, Thomas would go straight to the window. He would stand there for hours, his gaze fixed on that same spot. He ignored the toys she had carefully laid out. He ignored the new picture books she brought. He only looked at the garden. It was a silent, desperate plea. Eleanor felt it in her own chest, a tightening of sympathy and a rising tide of frustration. They were keeping him in a cage and wondering why he wouldn't sing. The decision solidified on a Thursday morning. The air was thick with the promise of rain, and the gray light filtering into the nursery seemed to sap all the color from the world. Thomas was at his post, a small silhouette against the gloom. Eleanor watched him, her heart aching. The risk was enormous. Defying a direct order from the Duke of Ashworth was grounds for immediate dismissal. She would be sent away in disgrace, just like the Governesses before her. She needed this position. The money was a lifeline she could not afford to lose. Her pride bristled at the thought of failure. But as she looked at Thomas, she realized there was a greater failure she feared more. The failure to even try. The failure to stand by while a child withered away in a prison of grief. She walked over to him, her shoes making no sound on the thick rug. For the first time, she stood directly beside him at the window. He did not flinch, but she felt a change in the air, a sudden awareness of her proximity. "It's a secret garden, isn't it?" she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. He gave no response, but she saw the tiniest tremor in his hand resting on the windowsill. Forgotten things can be found again, she continued. Sometimes they just need a little help. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and polish. Her own pulse was a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it. She was stepping off the path. She held out her hand. Come with me, Thomas, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. Let's go see the roses. He did not look at her hand. He continued to stare out the window as if he hadn't heard. Disappointment, sharp and cold, pricked at her. Perhaps she had misread everything. Perhaps he was simply lost in a world she could never reach. She started to pull her hand back, a flush of embarrassment warming her cheeks. And then his small fingers twitched. Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted his own hand from the windowsill and placed it in hers. His hand was small and cold, and his touch was as light as a moth's wing. It was not a grip, just a resting. But it was contact. It was acceptance. A jolt went through Eleanor, a surge of triumph so fierce it almost brought tears to her eyes. She curled her fingers gently around his, giving a soft squeeze of reassurance. He did not pull away. All right then, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Let's be brave together. Leading him from the nursery felt like a covert operation. Every footstep in the cavernous hallway seemed to shout their defiance. The portraits of Blackwood ancestors stared down with accusing eyes. She expected Mrs. Gable to appear at any moment, her face a thundercloud of righteous fury. She kept her grip on Thomas's hand firm but gentle, a lifeline between them. He walked beside her without a sound, his steps small and measured. But he did not resist. He was following her. He was trusting her. They reached the heavy oak door that led to the gardens. It was bolted at the top and bottom, clearly unused for a long time. The brass handle was tarnished. With her free hand, Eleanor struggled with the top bolt. It was stiff, and she had to put her shoulder into it. It finally gave way with a groan of protest that seemed to echo through the entire manor. The bottom bolt was just as stubborn. As she worked it loose, she glanced at Thomas. He was watching the door, his eyes wide, a flicker of something, perhaps anticipation, in their dark depths. The door swung open onto a wave of cool, damp air. It smelled of wet earth, of decaying leaves, and of the faint, sweet perfume of distant roses. It was the smell of life, messy and real. It was a world away from the sterile, wax-scented air of the house. Thomas hesitated on the threshold, his small hand tightening in hers. He looked from the overgrown wilderness before them back into the dark, familiar hallway. Eleanor knelt down so she was at his eye level. It's all right, she said softly. I'm right here. We'll just stay for a little while. She gave his hand another gentle squeeze and then took the first step out onto the flagstone patio. He followed, his small shoes making a soft scuffing sound on the stone. The garden was even wilder up close. Weeds grew thick and tall in the cracks between the stones. A stone bench was almost completely swallowed by ivy, but the air was fresh, and a lone robin, startled by their appearance, chirped an alarm before taking flight. Eleanor led him carefully down the crumbling stone steps and onto what was once a lawn. The grass was long and damp, clinging to their shoes. She made her way directly towards the struggling rosebush in the center. It looked even more forlorn from up close. Thorns and weeds were tangled around its base, choking it. Yet the few blooms it held were perfect, their pale pink petals beaded with moisture from the heavy air. They were defiant flags of beauty in a war against neglect. Without a word, she let go of Thomas's hand and knelt in the damp soil. She didn't care about the inevitable stains on her dress. She began to work, her fingers pulling at the thick, stubborn roots of the weeds. She cleared a small circle around the base of the bush, tossing the unwanted growth into a pile. Her hands were soon smudged with dirt. It was methodical work, quiet and focused. She was not just clearing weeds. She was making a space for life to breathe. She was showing him, not telling him, that things could be nurtured back to health. For a long time, Thomas just stood there watching her. He was a silent, still observer, his face unreadable. Eleanor continued her work, her movements calm and rhythmic. She cleared away a thick thistle that was pressing against the new bud. She gently untangled a thorny vine from one of the main stems. She could feel his eyes on her, a steady, unwavering gaze. She did not look up, giving him the space to simply be. Then she heard a faint rustle in the grass beside her. She paused, her hand hovering over a clump of clover. Out of the corner of her eyes, she saw him take a tentative step closer. And another, he stopped just inches from the rosebush. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. Slowly, so slowly, he unclenched one of his hands. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly. He did not aim for the petals, but for the dark, thorny stem. His touch was feather-light, a question more than a gesture. He traced the line of the stem downwards, his finger carefully avoiding the thorns. Then he moved his hand upwards towards one of the open blooms. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering just above the delicate pink petals. He looked at Eleanor, a silent question in his wide, expressive eyes. She gave him a small, encouraging nod. A faint smile touched her lips. His gaze returned to the flower. He reached out again, and this time his fingertips gently brushed against the edge of a petal. It was a moment of incredible delicacy, a connection being made not with words, but with a simple, reverent touch. A boy who had been locked away from the world was reaching out to touch something living. A small, almost imperceptible sigh escaped his lips. It was the first sound she had ever heard him make. It was barely more than a breath, but to Eleanor, it was a symphony. She felt a wave of warmth spread through her chest, a profound sense of rightness. This was worth any risk. This single, fragile moment was worth the wrath of a duke, worth the loss of her position. This was the beginning of a thaw. From the tall, arched window of his private library, Alistair Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth, looked down. His sanctuary was a fortress of silence and shadow, filled with the scent of old leather and the ghosts of happier times. He had been staring at the same page of a financial ledger for 10 minutes, his mind unable to focus. The oppressive quiet of the house was a familiar weight, a penance he embraced. But today, a flicker of movement in the neglected garden had caught his eye. He rose from his heavy leather chair and walked to the window, a frown already forming on his severe features. He expected to see a stray deer, or perhaps one of the groundskeepers shirking his duties. What he saw instead made the blood freeze in his veins, and then, just as quickly, begin to boil. It was her. The new governess, Eleanor Vance. She was kneeling in the dirt, her dress, which was always so immaculate, now smudged with soil, and beside her, standing impossibly close to the thorny, untamed rosebush, was Thomas, his son. His fragile, silent son, outside in the damp, unpredictable wildness of the ruined garden. She had broken his most fundamental rule. She had taken his child from the sterile safety of the nursery and brought him into a place of decay and chaos. He watched as the woman cleared weeds from the base of the plant his late wife had adored. An old, deep pain lanced through him, sharp and unwelcome. That was Catherine's rosebush. He had let the garden go precisely because he could not bear to see it, to be reminded of her laughter as she tended to it, her hands also covered in dirt. And now this stranger was touching it, altering it, bringing his son into the heart of a memory he had tried so desperately to bury. He saw Thomas reach out. He saw his son's small hand touch the flower. It was an intimate, gentle gesture that felt like a betrayal. A hot, dark anger surged through Alistair, eclipsing everything else. It was an anger born of grief, of fear, and of the violation of his control. He had built these walls, these rules, to keep the world at bay, to protect what was left of his shattered life. And this woman, this impertinent, defiant governess, had walked right through them as if they were nothing. His jaw clenched and his hands tightened into fists at his sides. He saw not a breakthrough, but a transgression. He saw not a moment of healing, but a reckless act of insubordination that threatened the fragile order he had fought so hard to maintain. His face, already a mask of cold severity, hardened into something darker, something furious. She had defied him, and she would answer for it. The chill of the evening air had begun to settle over the garden, but it was not the cold that made Eleanor shiver. It was the feeling of being watched. She had felt it moments before, a prickling on her skin that made her look up towards the manor. Through the dark glass of a high window, she had seen a silhouette, a tall, sharp figure that could only be one person, Duke Alistair Blackwood. His presence was a judgment, a silent condemnation that lingered long after the figure had stepped back into the shadows. She gathered Thomas's small hand in hers, the boy's touch still a fragile miracle. His fingers, stained with a little bit of earth from the rose bush, curled tentatively around hers. They walked back to the great house in silence, the heavy oak door closing behind them with a sound that felt final. An hour later, as twilight bled into true night, the summons came. Mrs. Gable appeared at the nursery door. Her face, always a carefully composed mask of professional duty, seemed carved from granite. There was no judgment in her eyes, but no sympathy either. She was simply a messenger, a conduit for the Duke's will. Her voice was as crisp and starched as her apron. His Grace requires your presence in the library, immediately. Eleanor's heart gave a single hard thump against her ribs. The library, the Duke's private sanctuary, a place no staff member entered without a direct and specific command. This was not a casual inquiry. It was a tribunal. She smoothed the front of her simple gray dress, a nervous habit she despised. She had to force her hands to her sides, to keep them still. She would not show him fear. She would meet this storm head-on. She gave Thomas a small, reassuring smile, though he was already lost in his own world, arranging a set of wooden soldiers on the floor. He seemed unaware of the tension that had just walked into the room. The walk to the library felt impossibly long. The corridors of Ashworth Manor were tunnels of silence, lined with the watchful eyes of portraits from generations past. Their painted faces seemed to follow her progress. Mrs. Gable walked a few paces ahead, her back ramrod straight, her footsteps silent on the thick carpets. Eleanor focused on the sound of her own breathing, keeping it even. She thought of the small, almost imperceptible warmth of Thomas's hand in hers. That was real. That was why she was here. That was the truth she would hold on to. Mrs. Gable stopped before a pair of towering mahogany doors. She did not knock. She simply opened one and stepped aside, her expression unreadable. "Miss Vance," she announced into the room, then retreated, pulling the door quietly shut behind Eleanor. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and something sharper, like whiskey and cold ash from the fireplace. It was vast, far larger than she had imagined. Floor-to-ceiling shelves crammed with thousands of books stood like silent sentinels. The only light came from a green-shaded lamp on a massive desk and the low, flickering flames in a hearth large enough to stand in. And there, in the center of it all, stood the Duke. He was not at his desk. He was standing by the fire, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, staring into the flames. He did not turn as she entered. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Eleanor felt like a specimen under glass. She waited, her posture straight, her gaze fixed on the back of his dark head. Finally he spoke, his voice low and devoid of any warmth. "You were given a set of simple, explicit instructions upon your arrival, Miss Vance." He still had not turned to look at her. His words were directed at the fire, as if she were merely an irritating presence in the air. Eleanor kept her own voice steady and calm. "I was, Your Grace." Among them was the rule that the baum is not to be taken outside the designated nursery and schoolroom areas without my express permission. He turned then, slowly. His face in the firelight was all sharp angles and deep shadows. His blue eyes were not just cold. They were like chips of ice. "Is your memory faulty, or did you simply choose to disregard a direct order?" She felt a flash of anger, but pushed it down. "My memory is perfectly fine, Your Grace. I made a considered decision." A single dark eyebrow rose. He seemed almost amused by her audacity, but it was a dangerous, predatory amusement. "A considered decision? You are a governess, Miss Vance. You are here to follow instructions, not to make considered decisions that countermand my own." He took a step away from the fireplace, moving towards her. He was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, and he used his height to intimidate. "You took my son, a fragile child, into a derelict, unkempt part of the grounds. You exposed him to who knows what. A fall, a cut, disease from the thorns." Eleanor did not take a step back. She held her ground, meeting his icy gaze. "I exposed him to the sun, Your Grace. I exposed him to the air. I let him see that something neglected can still have life in it. Her voice was quiet but carried the weight of her conviction. That rosebush was not a danger. It was a metaphor. Alistair stopped a few feet from her, his jaw tightening. The pretense of cold amusement vanished, replaced by sheer, undisguised fury. A metaphor? Do you think I pay you for poetry, Miss Vance? I pay you to bring order, to instill discipline, to break a stubborn silence that has been enabled by foolish sentimentality. And on your third day, you engage in it yourself. Is that what you think this is? She asked, a genuine surprise in her tone. Sentimentality? Your son has not spoken a word in a year. He lives inside a glass box of grief, and you are tapping on the walls with a ruler, expecting it to shatter. It will not work. She could feel her heart pounding now, a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it, the line she was crossing. But she could not turn back. He does not need more rules. He needs a reason to want to exist outside of his own head. He needs to see that life continues, that things can grow again. The Duke was speechless for a moment. He stared at her as if she had suddenly grown a second head. No one, it was clear, spoke to him this way. Not here, not in the heart of his power. His face was a thunderous mask. You know nothing of my son. You know nothing of my grief. The word grief was a jagged stone in his throat. I know what I see, Eleanor countered, her voice softening slightly, but losing none of its firmness. I see a little boy who stares at a dead garden all day because it is the only thing that reflects how he feels inside. I saw him today, for the first time, reach out and touch something beautiful, something alive. He did not smile, no, but his eyes, for a single moment, they were not empty. She took a small breath. Forgive my presumption, Your Grace, but is that not what you truly want? For his eyes to be filled with something other than ghosts? The mention of ghosts struck a nerve. A flicker of raw, unguarded pain crossed his features before being instantly suppressed, replaced by an even colder fury. He felt exposed, and he despised her for it. You are reckless and impertinent, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. You presume a knowledge of this family that you do not have. You walk into my home and you think you understand the complexities of this tragedy in a matter of days. I do not need to understand the complexities of the tragedy to understand the needs of a child, she replied, her own pride rising to meet his anger. She had been dismissed and condescended to her entire life. She would not be broken by it now. Children need warmth. They need patience. They need to know they are safe enough to feel. Your son is afraid of his own feelings, and your rigid regime is only teaching him that he is right to be. Alistair took another step, closing the distance between them until she had to tilt her head back to look at him. The scent of whiskey was stronger now, a bitter note in the air. He was trying to tower over her, to physically dominate the conversation. But Eleanor stood her ground, her spine straight as a steel rod. His shadow fell over her, but she did not flinch. I have dismissed 6 governesses, Miss Vance, 6 women with far more experience than you who understood the meaning of professional boundaries. And did any of them make a difference? She asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them, a direct and undeniable challenge. Or did they simply collect their salary while your son faded a little more each day? The silence that followed was electric. It was a battle of wills fought in the space of a few feet. His anger was a palpable force, a wave of cold energy pressing against her. But her quiet certainty was a rock, refusing to be moved. He saw no fear in her eyes. He saw conviction. He saw a woman who believed with every fiber of her being that she was right, and it infuriated him. It infuriated him because a small, treacherous part of him wondered if she was. He saw the defiance, but underneath it, he saw a plea, not for herself, but for Thomas. He was the Duke. He was the master of this house. He could not lose this battle. He could not allow his authority to be so flagrantly undermined. He had to regain control. He took a sharp breath, his chest rising, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might shout. Instead, he drew himself up to his full, formidable height, his expression freezing over once more into a mask of pure, aristocratic disdain. "You are on the thinnest of ice, Miss Vance," he once said, his voice a low, threatening whisper. "You believe you have won some small victory today. You have not. You have only proven that you are as naive as all the rest." He pointed a single commanding finger towards the door. "Go back to the nursery. You will adhere to the schedule I have set. You will follow every rule to the letter. You will not deviate. You will not experiment. And you will not take my son out of his rooms again." He turned his back on her, a clear and final dismissal. He walked back to the fireplace, once again presenting her with nothing but his rigid posture. The audience was over. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, the echo of his words ringing in her ears. Her entire body was trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. She had said things no employee should ever say to an employer. She had challenged a grieving man in his own sanctuary. She had likely sealed her own fate. But as she turned and walked towards the door, she did not feel defeated. She felt a strange, soaring sense of clarity. She had spoken the truth. Whatever happened now, she had spoken for Thomas. She pulled the heavy door open and stepped out into the silent hallway. As the latch clicked shut behind her, the sound seemed to sever a taut wire that had been stretched between them. Inside the library, Alistair did not move. He listened to her footsteps fade down the corridor until there was only the sound of the fire crackling. He clenched his hand on the mantelpiece, his knuckles turning white. He had won. He had silenced her. He had reasserted his command. So why did it feel so much like a loss? He finally let out the breath he had been holding. It came out as a ragged, frustrated sound. He stared into the flames, but he did not see them. He saw a small boy's hand reaching for a rose. He saw a flash of clear, determined gray eyes that held no fear of him. He saw life. A defiant, stubborn, infuriating spark of it. Alistair dismissed her with a final icy warning. "Do not defy me again." The air between them was electric with unresolved tension. She had left his presence, but she had not left the room. Her words, her accusations, her impossible courage remained behind, haunting the suffocating silence. The heavy oak door of the study clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing the finality of the Duke's words. Eleanor Vance stood alone in the corridor, her body rigid, her hands clenched into tight fists out of her sides. The air still vibrated with the force of his anger, a cold fury that had felt less like heat and more like the chilling pressure of the deep sea. "Do not defy me again." The command was not a suggestion. It was a blade held to the tenderest part of her resolve. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. For a fleeting moment, she felt a terrifying urge to turn, to run from Ashworth Manor and its suffocating grief. But then she thought of Thomas. She pictured his small back, the slight curve of his spine as he stared out the window into a world that had taken everything from him. The Duke's pride was a fortress, but Thomas was the prisoner trapped within its walls. Eleanor took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing her hands to unclench. Fear was a luxury she could not afford. Defiance, she was beginning to understand, was a necessity. She turned not towards the exit, but back towards the nursery, her steps measured and quiet on the cold stone floor. The battle had been declared, but the war for the soul of a child had only just begun. The next few days passed in a state of fragile truce. The Duke remained unseen, a ghost haunting the far reaches of the manor. Eleanor kept to her duties with meticulous care, avoiding the gardens and any other act that could be construed as a challenge. She and Thomas existed in the quiet space of the nursery, a world self-contained and silent. She read to him from books of geography and botany, her voice a low, steady murmur against the oppressive quiet of the house. He listened, or seemed to, but remained a distant shore she could not reach. One afternoon, while a soft rain misted the windows, Eleanor was tidying the nursery. She gathered stray blocks and straightened the small collection of untouched tin soldiers on a shelf. As she knelt to wipe a smudge from the floorboards near Thomas's small desk, her fingers brushed against a section of wood that felt loose. Curiosity piqued, she pressed down gently. The board gave way with a soft groan, revealing a shallow hollow beneath. Tucked inside was a neat stack of drawing paper, held together with a faded blue ribbon. Her breath caught in her throat. She had provided him with paper and charcoal, but he never drew when she was watching. He would only sit at his desk, the materials laid out before him, his hands still in his lap. She had assumed he simply had no interest. Now she understood he had been working in secret, hiding his world from view. With trembling fingers, she lifted the stack of papers. She untied the ribbon and laid the first sheet on the floor. It was a landscape, drawn in stark black charcoal, a horizon line cut across the center of the page. Below it was an empty field. Above it was an empty sky. There was nothing else. No sun, no clouds, no birds. She turned to the next page. It was the same, and the next. Page after page revealed the same desolate scene. Sometimes there was a single leafless tree, its branches like skeletal fingers reaching for a sky that offered nothing. Sometimes the horizon was broken by the faint outline of a distant, barren hill. But there was never any life. There were no people, no animals, no houses. It was the landscape of absolute loneliness. Eleanor sat back on her heels, the papers spread around her like fallen leaves in a dead winter. This was his soul, laid bare on paper. This was the world he inhabited every moment of every day, an empty field beneath an empty sky. Her earlier efforts, the walk in the garden, the gentle reading, suddenly felt woefully inadequate. She had been trying to coax him out of his world, when what he needed was for someone to bring light into it. The Duke saw a stubborn child who needed discipline. Mrs. Gable saw a broken thing to be managed. But as Eleanor looked at the bleak drawings, she saw an artist painting his own grief over and over, unable to imagine any other color but gray. A profound sadness washed over her, so heavy it felt like a physical weight. She carefully gathered the drawings, retied the ribbon, and placed them back in their hiding spot, pushing the floorboard gently into place. Her heart ached for the small boy who carried such a vast emptiness inside him. That evening, as Thomas sat at his desk, his back to her, she did not open a book. She simply sat in her chair by the window, watching the last of the daylight fade, and began to speak. Her voice was soft, weaving a new kind of lesson into the twilight. She did not talk of rainfall totals or the Latin names for flowers. She told him of the ancient world, of how people long ago looked at the same empty sky and filled it with heroes and monsters, with queens and hunters. She told him of Cassiopeia, a vain queen banished to the heavens to circle the northern star forever, a reminder of the perils of pride. She described the chair made of the stars, how it tilted and turned through the seasons. Thomas's hand, which had been resting on a fresh sheet of paper, did not move, but she saw the line of his shoulders lose some of its tension. The next day, she told him the story of Perseus, the hero who flew on winged sandals and faced a monster that could turn men to stone with a single glance. She spoke of courage and cleverness, of using a polished shield as a mirror to avoid a deadly gaze. While she spoke, the faint, rhythmic scratching of charcoal against paper began. It was a hesitant sound, but it was there. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window, pretending not to notice. She did not want to startle him, to make him retreat back into his fortress of silence. She just kept her voice steady, a thread of sound spinning a tapestry of myth in the quiet room. She told him of Orion, the great hunter, placed in the sky with his loyal dogs, Sirius and Procyon, forever chasing the 7 shy sisters of the Pleiades. She described his belt, 3 bright stars in a perfect, straight line, a beacon for lost sailors. She talked of the fiery red star, Betelgeuse, that marked his shoulder, a giant heart beating in the chest of a celestial warrior. The scratching from the desk became more confident, a steady whisper of creation. Eleanor allowed a small, fragile hope to bloom in her chest. She was not asking anything of him. She was simply offering him a universe of stories, a new way to see the sky. For a week, this became their new ritual. Lessons in the morning, a quiet lunch, and then the long afternoons filled with the epics of the heavens. Eleanor exhausted her memory of Greek myths and moved on to Norse tales of Odin and Thor, of the rainbow bridge Bifrost and the great world tree, Yggdrasil. She spoke of dragons hoarding gold and brave knights on impossible quests. Through it all, Thomas drew. At the end of each day, he would gather his work and slip it beneath the loose floorboard before Mrs. Gable came to take him for his bath. Eleanor never looked. She gave him the dignity of his secrets, praying that the seeds she was planting in the darkness would one day find their way to the light. One evening after Thomas was asleep, a profound exhaustion settled over Eleanor. She sat alone in the nursery, the silence now feeling less oppressive and more like a held breath. A week of stories, a week of pouring her own spirit into the void, with no certainty it was making any difference. Had she been a fool? Was she just another governess talking to herself in a silent room? Deluding herself with false hope, the Duke's cynical voice echoed in her memory. She won't last a week. It had been more than a week, but had she accomplished anything at all? Driven by a sudden need to know, she knelt by the desk. Her hand hesitated over the loose floorboard. It felt like a betrayal, an invasion of the one private space he had. But she had to know. Was his world still as empty as it had been a week ago? She whispered an apology into the quiet room, a plea for forgiveness to the sleeping boy down the hall. Then she lifted the board. The stack of drawings was thicker now. She took it out, her fingers clumsy as she untied the ribbon. The first few sheets were familiar. The barren field, the stark horizon. Her heart sank. She had failed. She had spoken of heroes in bonds, and he had still only seen emptiness. She flipped through them faster now, a growing sense of despair chilling her skin. More bare trees, more empty skies. It was all the same. She was at the last drawing, the one from that very afternoon. She had told him the story of Andromeda, the princess chained to a rock as a sacrifice, saved at the last moment by the hero Perseus. She looked down at the paper in her hands. It showed the same desolate landscape as all the others. The same flat earth, the same vast, lonely sky. A wave of defeat washed over her. So sharp it brought tears to her eyes. It was useless. The grief was too deep, the silence too profound. She had given him everything she had, and it was not enough. But then, as she was about to put the drawing away, her eye caught something. In the upper right corner of the paper, in the great gray expanse of the charcoal sky, was a tiny speck of white. She lifted the paper closer to the dim lamplight, her breath catching in her chest. It was not a smudge. It was not an accident. It was a deliberate mark, a small, perfect circle scratched into the dark charcoal with a sharp point revealing the white of the paper beneath. A star, a single tiny star hanging alone in the immense desolate sky of his creation. Eleanor stared at it, unable to move. It was so small, so faint. A lesser person might have missed it entirely. But to her, it shone with the brilliance of a supernova. He had heard her. In his world of unending twilight, he had put a light in the sky. He had taken her story, her words, and he had made a star. A sob, sharp and sudden, escaped her lips. It was not a sound of sadness, but of overwhelming, earth-shattering relief. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto her hands as she clutched the precious piece of paper. He was still in there. Lost, yes. Hurting, absolutely. But he was there, and he was listening. She carefully placed the drawing on the very top of the stack, retied the ribbon with shaking hands, and returned the treasure to its hiding place. She stood up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, and walked to the window. Outside, the real night sky was obscured by clouds, but in her mind's eye, she saw it filled with heroes and queens, hunters and beasts, and among them a new constellation, the one that mattered more than any other, a single brave star drawn by the hand of a silent boy. Eleanor's heart swelled with hope, a warm, powerful tide rising against the shores of her doubt. But as she looked at the dark silhouette of the manor against the night, she knew she was still only scratching the surface of his profound grief. The tiny star drawn in the sky of an otherwise empty world was a fragile victory. Eleanor felt its light, a pinprick of warmth against the pervasive chill of Ashworth Manor. Yet, as the days folded into a quiet week, that single star began to feel less like a destination and more like a distant, lonely beacon in an endless night. Hope was a delicate thing, she knew. It could be easily starved, and she sensed a hunger in Thomas that her stories, her patient readings, and her tending of the garden could not yet satisfy. The surface was scratched, but the profound grief beneath remained untouched, a vast, frozen ocean. Sleep did not come easily to her in that house. The silence of the manor was not peaceful. It was heavy, weighted with unspoken words and memories that seemed to seep from the very stones. Tonight was no different. Eleanor lay in her bed, listening to the old house settle, its groans like the sighs of a restless sleeper. A floorboard creaked somewhere down the hall. Then another. She had grown accustomed to the manor's nocturnal language, but this sound was different. It was softer, more deliberate. It was the sound of small, unshod feet. She sat up, her heart giving a slight, nervous flutter. Her first thought was of Thomas. Was he ill? Was he having a nightmare? She slipped out of bed, pulling her dressing gown around her shoulders against the cold air. The floorboards were frigid beneath her bare feet as she eased her door open. The long corridor was a chasm of shadows, broken only by a single tall window at the far end where the moon cast a pale silver rectangle onto the dark wood floor. There was no one there. She held her breath, listening. The sound came again, fainter this time, from downstairs. Driven by an instinct she did not question, Eleanor moved silently along the hallway. She kept to the edge of the runner, her steps muffled by the thick wool. The main staircase was a grand, sweeping curve of dark oak that descended into the cavernous entrance hall. From the landing, she could see most of the ground floor, a landscape of looming furniture draped in dust sheets, looking like a congregation of shrouded ghosts. Everything was still. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. Perhaps it was just the house, breathing its sorrowful, lonely breaths. But then she saw him, a small figure, almost lost in the immense scale of the gallery that branched off the main hall. Thomas. He was standing perfectly still, his back to her. He wore his simple white nightshirt, making him appear small and ethereal in the gloom. He wasn't looking at the suits of armor that stood like silent sentinels along the wall. He wasn't looking at the tapestries depicting ancient, forgotten battles. His entire being was focused on one thing, the grand portrait that dominated the far wall, the portrait of the late Duchess. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had seen the painting before, of course. It was impossible to miss. In a house of shadows and severity, it was a defiant splash of life. A beautiful woman with hair the color of warm honey and eyes that held a universe of kindness. She was smiling, not a polite, formal smile for the artist, but a genuine, radiant expression of joy, as if she were sharing a wonderful secret with the viewer. It was the face of a woman deeply loved, and who loved deeply in return. Seeing it always gave Eleanor a pang of sadness for the loss, for the light that had been extinguished from this house. But seeing Thomas standing before it, a lone child paying homage in the dead of night, was something else entirely. It was a pilgrimage. This was his secret ritual, his place of worship. Eleanor felt like an intruder on something sacred and deeply private. She should retreat, go back to her room and pretend she had seen nothing. It was the proper thing to do. It was what Mrs. Gable would expect. It was what the Duke, in his cold and rigid world, would demand. Yet, she couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the spot. Something held her there, a powerful sense of duty that went far beyond her employment. This was not about lessons or discipline. This was about a child's soul, adrift and alone in the dark. She began to descend the stairs, her hand trailing along the smooth, cold banister. She made no sound, each step a careful, measured placement. As she drew closer, the moonlight from the gallery's high-arched windows illuminated the scene more clearly. Thomas stood with his small hands clasped behind his back, his posture strangely formal, like a soldier at attention. He was looking up at the smiling face of his mother, his own face a mask of solemn concentration. Eleanor stopped a few yards behind him, her heart aching with a compassion so fierce it was almost painful. How many nights had he done this? How many times had he crept from his bed to stand here, seeking a comfort that a painted canvas could never truly give? He was so close to the painting, as if trying to absorb the warmth that emanated from it, to feel the love in those painted eyes. It was then that she saw it, a glint of wetness on his cheek, catching the moonlight. A single perfect tear slid down his pale skin, followed by another. He made no sound. There were no hitches in his breathing, no sheaves tearing from his throat. It was a purely silent weeping, a grief so profound it had no voice. The sight shattered what little professional composure Eleanor had left. The polite distance between governess and charge dissolved in that moment. All she saw was a little boy, crying for his mother. Her mind raced. What was the right thing to do? To speak would be to break the spell, to startle him and send him fleeing. To touch him might be a violation of the fragile trust she had worked so hard to build. He had never initiated physical contact, had never sought it, but to do nothing felt like a betrayal. To leave him to cry alone in the dark seemed the cruelest option of all. She thought of the star he had drawn, that tiny spark of hope. It was not enough to light this depth of darkness. He needed an anchor. She took a final, silent step forward. Then she slowly lowered herself to her knees, the cold of the marble floor seeping through the thin fabric of her nightclothes. She was now at his level, no longer a towering adult, but a companion in the shadows. She stayed there for a long moment, simply sharing the space with him, letting him know he was no longer alone. He didn't seem to notice her, his gaze still locked on the portrait. His small shoulders were tense, his whole body rigid with the effort of holding his sorrow inside. Slowly, carefully, Eleanor lifted her hand. She held it suspended in the air for a second, a silent question. Then she gently placed it on his shoulder. The reaction was instantaneous. His entire body flinched, a sharp, sudden jerk as if he'd been burned. Eleanor's heart plummeted. She had made a mistake. She had pushed too far, too soon. She began to pull her hand back, a silent apology forming on her lips. But then something shifted. The tension in his small frame did not return. Instead, after that initial, startled reaction, he seemed to soften. The rigid line of his shoulders relaxed just a fraction. He took a slow, shaky breath. Eleanor kept her hand steady, a warm, reassuring weight. She did not pat or rub his shoulder. She just held it, offering a simple, solid point of contact in his swirling world of loss. They remained like that for what felt like an eternity, kneeling together in the moonlight, a grieving boy and a woman who refused to let him grieve alone. The silence in the gallery was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. And then, the impossible happened. Slowly, hesitantly, as if moving a limb that had long been asleep, Thomas leaned. He tilted his small body sideways, just an inch at first, then another, until the side of his head, with its soft, dark hair, came to rest against Eleanor's arm. His weight was so slight, yet it felt immense. It was the weight of trust, the weight of a year of unspoken pain, the weight of a child finally, for one brief, fragile moment, allowing himself to be held. Eleanor froze, every muscle in her body locking into place. She hardly dared to breathe for fear of breaking the spell. She could feel the warmth of him, the faint, clean scent of soap and sleep. She could feel the slight tremor that ran through his body as another silent tear escaped and dampened the sleeve of her dressing gown. Her own eyes burned. This was it. This was the connection she had been searching for. It wasn't in a book or a garden or a drawing. It was here in the dark, in a shared moment of profound and silent sorrow. He wasn't just a charge anymore. He was Thomas, and he was breaking her heart. She rested her cheek against the top of his head, a gesture so natural it felt like instinct. She closed her eyes, pouring all the warmth, all the comfort, all the strength she possessed into that single point of contact. She wanted to tell him it was all right to cry. She wanted to tell him she was there. She wanted to promise him that the sun would rise again. But she knew words were useless here. So she said nothing and simply held him as he leaned against her, a small ship finding a temporary harbor in a storm. The moment was perfect, a fragile crystal of connection in the cold, hard house. And like a crystal, it was destined to shatter. It happened without warning. He pulled away. It wasn't a gentle withdrawal. It was a sudden, violent recoil, as if he had touched a hot stove. He scrambled backward, his eyes wide, not with sadness now, but with something that looked like pure shock. He looked at her, then at the space between them where he had just been leaning, as if he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. It was as if his own need for comfort, his own brief surrender to it, had terrified him. The vulnerability was too much. The walls he had built so carefully around his heart had been breached, and the panic was immediate. He stared at her for one more second, his expression a chaotic mix of fear and confusion. He looked like a wild creature caught in a trap, desperate to escape. He opened his mouth as if to say something, a gasp or a cry, but no sound came out. Then he turned and fled. His bare feet made soft, frantic slapping sounds on the polished floor, the noise echoing unnaturally loud in the vast, silent gallery. He didn't look back. He just ran, a small white ghost disappearing back into the shadows from which he came. The sound of his footsteps faded as he reached the staircase, growing fainter and fainter until they were gone completely. And Eleanor was alone. She remained on her knees on the cold marble floor, the place on her arm where his head had rested now feeling shockingly cold. The warmth was gone. The weight was gone. She was left with nothing but the echo of the moment. She slowly raised her head, her gaze following the path Thomas had taken, up to the smiling woman in the portrait. The Duchess's eyes seemed to look right at her painted expression full of life and joy, utterly oblivious to the silent tragedy that had just unfolded at her feet. She was forever trapped in a moment of happiness, while her son was trapped in a prison of grief. Eleanor looked at the smiling face, and for the first time, she felt a flicker not of sadness, but of frustration. It was a beautiful memory, but it was also a wall, a beautiful, smiling wall that Thomas could not get past. Eleanor slowly got to her feet, her joints aching from the cold. The single star in the drawing was not enough. A moment of shared grief was not enough. She understood now. To truly reach Thomas, to lead him out of the darkness, she couldn't just offer him a new light. She had to find a way to connect him to the light he had lost. The silence that followed Thomas's flight was heavier than any before it. Eleanor remained on her knees in the grand gallery, the cold of the marble floor seeping through her dress. Her hand, which had briefly held the boy's shoulder, felt strangely empty. He had leaned into her. For one fragile second, he had accepted comfort. Then just as quickly, he had recoiled, as if touching warmth had burned him. The smiling woman in the portrait seemed to look down at her painted eyes full of a life that this house had since forgotten. A deep ache settled in Eleanor's chest. It was a feeling of being so close to a shore only to be dragged back out by a merciless tide. The next few days were a study in retreat. Thomas was present in body, but his spirit had receded further than ever. He sat at his small desk in the nursery, his back ramrod straight, refusing to even look at the new box of charcoal pencils Eleanor had set out. Her voice, as she read aloud from a book of simple adventures, felt like a stone skipping across a frozen lake. It made a sound, but it left no mark and certainly broke no ice. Even the walled garden lost its appeal. He would stand at the window and look, but when Eleanor gestured towards the door, he would turn away with a finality that felt like a slammed door in her face. Eleanor felt a familiar cold dread creeping in. It was the fear of failure. She had been so sure that patience and kindness were the answer. But what if the Duke was right? What if the boy's grief was a fortress so high that no ladder of compassion could ever scale its walls? She found herself staring out at the gray, weeping sky, the oppressive silence of the manor mirroring the stillness in her own heart. She had reached a wall. She could feel it, solid and insurmountable, and she did not know how to go around it. One afternoon, while tidying the nursery after another fruitless day, a quiet knock came at the door. It was a young maid, Sarah, her arms full of fresh linens. She was a girl of maybe 18 with nervous eyes that always seemed to be checking the corridors for Mrs. Gable. She curtsied, her movements quick and bird-like. "Begging your pardon, miss, for the beds." Eleanor offered a tired smile. "Thank you, Sarah. Just place them there." The maid did as she was told, but she hesitated before leaving. She cast a glance at the empty chair where Thomas usually sat, then looked at Eleanor's weary face. She bit her lip, a clear struggle playing out in her expression. The rules of the house were absolute. Staff did not engage. They did not gossip. They were to be invisible. But something in Eleanor's quiet dignity seemed to invite confidence. "Miss Vance," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "I hope you don't mind me saying, I've seen you with Master Thomas. In the garden. I hear you reading to him." She wrung her hands in her apron. "No one's ever tried so hard. The others, they just shouted or left him alone." Eleanor's shoulders relaxed slightly. It was the first hint of affirmation she had received from anyone in this house. "I'm not sure my trying is making much of a difference, Sarah." The girl took a half-step closer, her voice dropping even lower, laced with a conspiratorial urgency. "It is, miss. It's just, he's lost the path back, and the signposts are all gone." She took a deep breath, as if plunging into cold water. "It's the books, miss, the stories." Eleanor frowned. "I read to him every day." Not just any stories, Sarah corrected gently. Her stories. The Duchess. She used to read to him every single night. It was their time. No matter what guests were here, no matter how late, she would always go up to the nursery. You could hear her laughing sometimes. This house used to have laughter in it. A shadow of memory passed over the young maid's face. Eleanor felt a current of electricity run through her. She leaned forward slightly, her full attention now on the girl. What stories, Sarah, do you know? Sarah nodded, her eyes darting towards the door again. There was one book in particular. He loved it more than any other. She read from it so often they say she knew most of the tales by heart. She paused, her voice trembling with the weight of the secret she was sharing. It was called Tales of the Northern Sky, a big, heavy book with a silver star on the cover. Tales of the Northern Sky. The phrase echoed in Eleanor's mind, connecting with a flash to the small, solitary star Thomas had drawn. It wasn't just a random mark. It was a memory, a symbol of his mother, a light in his private darkness. Her heart began to beat faster. Where is this book, Sarah? Is it in the nursery library? Sarah shook her head, her expression turning from nervous to fearful. No, miss, that's the problem. After the accident, the Duke, he couldn't bear to see any of her things. He had them all packed away or locked up. She looked at Eleanor, her eyes wide with the gravity of her next words. That book, he keeps it in his private library. No one goes in there, miss, not even Mrs. Gable, unless she is expressly summoned. It's his place. The Duke's library, the heart of his power, the sanctuary of his grief. It was the one room in the entire manor that was completely, unequivocally forbidden. Eleanor felt the hope that had just surged in her collide with the cold reality of the Duke's authority. He had warned her with ice in his voice not to defy him again. To ask for this book would be more than defiance. It would be a direct intrusion into the most fortified part of his soul. It would be like asking a dragon to surrender a piece of its hoard. He locked it away, Eleanor repeated softly, more to herself than to Sarah. The cruelty of it, intentional or not, was staggering. In his own suffocating grief, he had taken from his son the one thing that might have offered a sliver of comfort, a connection to the mother he had lost. He's not a bad man, miss, Sarah whispered, as if sensing Eleanor's judgment. He's just broken. He looks at Master Thomas and sees her. He sees the day it happened. I think the silence is easier for him than the memories. Eleanor stood up, her mind racing. The pieces were all there now, the silent boy, the locked-away book, the single star drawn in an empty sky, the father trapped in his own prison of sorrow, inadvertently keeping his son locked in there with him. She looked at Sarah, whose face was pale with the fear of having said too much. Thank you, Sarah, Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady. It held a new note of purpose that made the young maid look up in surprise. You have been a great help. Your confidence is safe with me. After the maid scurried away, Eleanor stood motionless in the center of the quiet nursery. The air hummed with possibility. This was the key. She knew it with a certainty that resonated deep in her bones. All her efforts, the reading, the garden, the gentle patience, they were all attempts to build a new bridge to Thomas. But what he needed was someone to help him rebuild the old one, the one that led back to his mother. The risk was enormous. She could, and very likely would, be dismissed. The Duke's wrath was not something to be taken lightly. He had made his boundaries clear, and she was about to cross the most sacred one of all. She thought of her meager savings, the precariousness of her position, the humiliation of being sent away in failure, just as he had predicted. A week, he had said. She had lasted weeks, but this act could end it all in a single minute. Then she thought of Thomas. She pictured him standing before his mother's portrait, a silent tear tracing a path through the dust of his grief. She remembered the fleeting warmth of his small body leaning against hers, a desperate, unspoken plea for comfort. Was her pride, her position, her fear, more important than his chance at healing? Was it right to let a child starve emotionally because his father's pain had blinded him? No, it was not. Her duty was not just to the man who paid her wages, but to the silent child who was her charge. Her purpose here was not to follow rules that perpetuated suffering, but to alleviate it. The decision settled over her, not with a crash, but with a quiet, resolute calm. The fear did not vanish. It remained a cold knot in her stomach. But alongside it, a stronger feeling grew. Determination. It straightened her spine and lifted her chin. She would not be governed by the Duke's grief. She would challenge it. She smoothed the front of her dress and walked out of the nursery, leaving the door slightly ajar. The long hallway stretched before her, a corridor of shadows and silent judging portraits. Each tick of the grandfather clock at the far end sounded like a hammer blow, counting down the seconds to her confrontation. She passed Mrs. Gable, who was polishing a silver tray in an alcove. The housekeeper's hand stilled, and she looked up, her sharp eyes immediately registering the look on Eleanor's face. It was not a look of subservience or fear. It was a look of unshakable resolve. Mrs. Gable opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to question, perhaps to warn, but she said nothing. She simply watched as Eleanor continued on without breaking her stride. The air grew colder as she approached the West Wing, the Duke's private domain. The carpets here were thicker, swallowing the sound of her footsteps until all she could hear was the frantic beating of her own heart. But her steps did not falter. Her gaze was fixed ahead. It was fixed on the destination that had, only an hour ago, been an impossible thought, and was now an absolute necessity. She was no longer just a governess trying to keep her position. She was a woman with a mission, armed with a secret and fueled by a fierce protective empathy. She turned the final corner. There it was. At the very end of the hall, looming like the gate of a fortress, was the heavy oak door of the Duke's private library. It was darker than the other doors, carved with severe masculine lines. The brass handle was unadorned and dull, as if rarely touched by any hand but his. It was a door that did not invite entry. It commanded you to stay away. Eleanor walked with determined steps down the long, silent corridor, her eyes fixed upon that door, knowing that on the other side of it, everything would change. The heavy oak door felt like a final barrier, not just to a room, but to the very heart of the sorrow that suffocated Ashworth Manor. Eleanor's knuckles hovered over the polished wood, the grain smooth and cold beneath her skin. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a wild rhythm in the profound silence of the corridor. She could still hear the young maid's whispered words, a secret past in a shadowed corner. Tales of the Northern Sky. The name of the book was a key, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the lock was on the other side of this door. Her resolve was a fragile shield. She thought of Thomas, of the single tiny star he had drawn in a vast empty sky. She remembered the feeling of his small body leaning against hers for just a moment, a desperate, silent plea for comfort before he fled. That memory was all the strength she needed. She was not just a governess anymore. She was a champion for a boy lost in a forest of grief, and his father was the keeper of the only map that might lead him out. Eleanor raised her hand and knocked. 3 firm, deliberate raps that echoed in the hallway, loud as hammer blows. Then, silence. It descended again, thicker this time, pressing in on her. She waited, counting the seconds by her own frantic pulse. 1, 2, 3. She held her breath, listening for the sound of a chair scraping back, of footsteps, of a voice bidding her enter or be gone. Nothing. She knew he was in there. This was his ritual. After the house had settled into the quiet breathing of the night, the Duke would retreat to his library. He would lock the world out and commune with his ghosts. Perhaps he hadn't heard, or perhaps he had, and his silence was the answer. It was a dismissal, a command to disappear. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to turn around, to retreat to the safety of the nursery and try another less confrontational path. But there was no other path. She had tried patience. She had tried kindness. She had tried chipping away at the fortress walls from the outside. Now she had to walk through the main gate, taking a breath that felt thin and useless in her tight chest. She closed her hand around the cold, heavy brass handle. It did not turn easily. It felt as though she were pushing against the weight of the entire house, against years of settled grief and iron-willed solitude. The latch gave way with a sharp, metallic click that seemed to ricochet off the stone walls around her. She pushed the door inward. The air that met her was thick and still, saturated with the scent of old leather, drying paper, and the faint, sharp bite of whiskey. Deeper than that was the smell of a fire that had been burning for hours, a smell of wood smoke and cold ash. The room was a cavern of shadows, paneled in dark mahogany, that drank the light from the single lamp burning on a distant table. Bookshelves soared from the floor to the ornate ceiling, their spines a somber tapestry of gold-leaf titles in dark leather. It was not a room for reading, it was a tomb for words. And there he was. Alistair Blackwood was not at his desk. He stood with his back to her, facing the grand fireplace, where low flames licked listlessly at a blackened log. He was a silhouette of perfect stillness, one hand braced on the marble mantelpiece, the other holding a heavy crystal glass. The firelight caught the amber of the whiskey inside, making it glow like a captured ember. He wore no jacket, and the fine white linen of his shirt seemed to pull tight across the tension in his shoulders. He looked less like the master of the house and more like a prisoner in his own sanctuary. For a heartbeat, Eleanor felt a pang of something other than fear. It was a flicker of pity for the man lost in this self-imposed exile. He was as trapped as his son, just in a different room. But the feeling was fleeting, burned away by the purpose that had brought her here. She took a single soft step into the room, and the heavy door swung slowly shut behind her, the latch clicking into place with a sound of utter finality. The sound broke the spell. Alistair did not turn quickly. His movement was slow, deliberate, as if he were waking from a long and terrible dream. First his head turned, and in the dim light she saw his profile, sharp and unforgiving as a blade. Then his whole body followed. His eyes found her. They were not just angry, they were violated. It was the look of a man who has found a stranger standing in the most private, sacred corner of his own mind. The air crackled, growing heavy and charged, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the force of his fury like a physical blow. His gaze was meant to pin her to the spot, to make her wither and apologize and flee. Her own pride, the very quality that had so often been her downfall, was now her only anchor. She lifted her chin. She would not be intimidated. Not when Thomas's future was at stake. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she refused to let it show on her face. She had to cross the room, a vast expanse of Persian carpet that seemed to stretch for miles. She began to walk. She did not look at him. She fixed her eyes on the massive carved desk that dominated the center of the library. It was his throne of power, laden with neat stacks of paper, a silver letter opener, and a heavy inkwell. She focused on it as a sailor focuses on a distant lighthouse in a storm. Each step was a silent declaration. I am not afraid. I have a right to be here. Her shoes made no sound on the thick wool, but her presence screamed through the silence. She could feel his eyes tracking her, a burning weight on the side of her face. She imagined his hand tightening around his glass, the crystal groaning under the pressure. When she finally reached the desk, she placed her hands lightly on the cool, polished wood, grounding herself. Only then did she turn her head to face him fully. He hadn't moved from his position by the fire. He was watching her with a dangerous stillness, his face a mask of cold, controlled rage. The shadows cast by the fire danced across his features, making it impossible to read the depths of his expression, but the glacial blue of his eyes was unmistakable. It was pure, undiluted fury. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times, but now, with the reality of his presence before her, the words felt flimsy and inadequate. She swallowed, her throat dry. Her voice, when it came, was lower than she intended, but it was steady. There was no tremor in it. Your Grace, she began, the formal title a strange alien sound in the charged intimacy of the room. He said nothing. He simply stared, letting the silence stretch, using it as a weapon. He was daring her to continue, to dig her own grave deeper with every word. Eleanor drew another breath. I have come to ask you for something. She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. This was not a servant making a humble request. This was a direct appeal, an intrusion. She was forcing a confrontation he had spent a year avoiding. It is for Thomas, she added, and that was the crux of it. This was not for her. This was for his son, his silent, grieving, forgotten son. A muscle jumped in Alistair's jaw. The name hung between them, a ghost she had dared to summon in his holiest of holies. Still he remained silent, a statue carved from ice and fury. He lifted the glass to his lips and took a slow, deliberate swallow of whiskey, his eyes never leaving her face. It was a gesture of supreme dismissal, an act meant to show her just how little her presence, her words, her entire being mattered to him. But she would not be dismissed. She had come too far. She straightened her spine, pulling her dignity around her like a cloak. "There is a book," she said, her voice gaining strength. "A book of myths and legends that his mother used to read to him. It is called Tales of the Northern Sky." At the mention of his late wife, a flicker of raw, unguarded pain crossed his face. It was there and gone in an instant. So fast she might have imagined it, replaced again by that cold, hard mask. But she had seen it. It was the first genuine crack in his armor she had ever witnessed. "The maids say you keep it here. In this library," she pressed on, her gaze unwavering. "I believe that hearing those stories again, in his mother's voice through the memory of the words, might help him. It might give him a connection to what he has lost. A path back. I am asking you to let me have it. For him." She had laid it all bare. Her strategy, her hope, her blatant defiance of his authority. She had walked into his fortress, spoken the name of his son, invoked the memory of his wife, and made a demand. The air in the room grew so thick it was difficult to breathe. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire and the frantic, silent beat of her own heart. For a long moment, Alistair simply looked at her. She saw a storm of emotions warring in his eyes, the raw grief of his loss, the cold fury at her intrusion, and something else, something she could not name. It was a flash of disbelief, of sheer astonishment at her audacity. No one had challenged him like this, not here, not ever. He set his glass down on the mantelpiece. The sound of crystal meeting marble was a sharp, definitive crack. It was the sound of a decision being made. He pushed himself away from the fireplace, turning to face her fully. He seemed to grow taller, broader, his presence filling the already suffocating room. The shadows fell away from his face, and she saw it clearly now. It was wiped clean of all emotion except one, a pure, chilling, and absolute rage. He took one slow step toward the desk, then another. He moved with a predator's grace, silent and menacing. He stopped on the opposite side of the great desk, the width of the polished wood, the only thing separating them. He placed his hands flat on its surface, leaning forward slightly, his gaze boring into her. The silence was absolute. Then he rose to his full, imposing height, a dark and terrible figure of authority. His face was a mask of cold fury. When he finally spoke, his voice was not a shout. It was far, far worse. It was a low, dangerous whisper that cut through the silence like a shard of ice. "How dare you?" The words hung in the air between them, sharp and cold as shards of ice. "How dare you?" It was not a question, it was a judgment, delivered from the height of his power, from the center of his fortress of grief. The firelight flickered across Alistair Blackwood's face, carving deep shadows under his cheekbones and turning his eyes into dark, unforgiving pits. The scent of whiskey and old leather, which had seemed distinguished moments before, now felt suffocating, like the air in a sealed tomb. Eleanor's own breath caught in her throat, a small, traitorous thing. She could feel the pulse in her neck, a frantic drum against the oppressive silence. Every instinct screamed at her to apologize, to retreat, to melt back into the shadows of the Grand Manor. But then she thought of Thomas, a small ghost haunting these cavernous halls, and her fear was eclipsed by a cold, hard resolve. Alistair took a step forward, his tall frame seeming to consume what little light there was in the room. "You come into my house," he began, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. "You defy my explicit instructions. You trespass in my private rooms. And now you stand before me in this place and demand something that is mine." He set the whiskey glass down on the desk with a sharp click, the sound like a gavel falling. His anger was a physical presence, a wave of heat rolling off him, more intense than the fire in the hearth. Eleanor kept her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her knuckles white. She had to keep them still, otherwise he would see them tremble. "You think you understand this family? This house? My son, he sneered, the word son laced with a pain so profound it was almost a wound in the air. You are an employee, Miss Vance, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, more dangerous. A temporary fixture. You are here to follow instructions, not to play psychologist, not to dig into matters that do not concern you. He began to pace, a caged animal in his own gilded prison. I have seen your kind before, full of modern theories and misplaced sympathy. You see a grieving child and you think you can fix him with a gentle voice in a storybook. You think you can manipulate him, and by extension, manipulate me. The accusation struck her, a clean, sharp blow. He saw her compassion as a strategy, her empathy as a tool for advancement. The injustice of it burned away the last of her fear. That is not true, she said, her voice clearer and stronger than she expected. It did not waver. He stopped his pacing and turned to face her fully, his eyes narrowing. It is not manipulation to see a child who is drowning in silence and to try to throw him a rope. It is not insolence to seek the one thing that might comfort him. She took a small step forward, closing the distance between them, an act of sheer audacity that made him stiffen. I have not come here for myself, Your Grace. I have not come here to challenge your authority. I have come here for Thomas. You will not speak his name in that tone, Alistair snapped, a flash of raw agony in his eyes. You do not have the right. And what right do you have? Eleanor shot back, her own control finally cracking. The words tumbled out, fueled by weeks of frustration by the sight of that lonely little boy. What right do you have to keep him locked in this mausoleum of a house, surrounded by silence and rules? He needs more than lessons in a sterile nursery. He needs life. He needs memory. He needs his mother. At the last word, Alistair flinched as if she had physically struck him. The mask of cold fury slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the shattered man beneath. It was a glimpse into a chasm of pain so deep, Eleanor almost regretted her words. Almost. You know nothing, he whispered, the sound raw. I know what I see, she pressed on, her voice softening slightly, but losing none of its conviction. I see a boy who stands before his mother's portrait and weeps without a sound. I see a boy who draws empty fields and adds a single star only when he hears a story of hope. And I have been told that his mother, the woman in that portrait, used to read to him from a book of myths, a book called Tales of the Northern Sky. She gestured vaguely toward the towering shelves of leather-bound volumes that surrounded them. A book that you keep locked away in here along with everything else that reminds you of her. The truth of her words hung between them, undeniable and terrible. His anger was a shield, his rules a fortress built to keep the past at bay. But in protecting himself, he was starving his son. Your grief has made you blind, Your Grace, she said, her voice now quiet, yet carrying more weight than any shout. And your pride is costing your son the one thing he needs most, not a governess, not a duke, but a father who is willing to remember. She held his gaze, her clear gray eyes refusing to look away from his stormy blue ones. In that moment, she was not his employee. She was a woman speaking a hard truth to a man who had forgotten how to feel anything but loss. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle and hiss of the logs in the fireplace. Alistair stared at her, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped along his cheek. She saw a war being fought behind his eyes, a battle between his ironclad control and the unbearable truth she had just laid bare. He looked from her to the shelves, then back to her. His chest rose and fell with a ragged breath. He was a man cornered not by her, but by his own heart. The explosive anger she had expected did not come. Instead, something inside him seemed to break. With a sudden, violent movement, he spun away from her and strode toward the far wall of the library. His boots were heavy and loud on the polished floor. He did not need to search. His hand went directly to a specific shelf, high up in the shadows. His fingers brushed against a dark blue spine, hesitating for a barest fraction of a second. In that tiny pause, Eleanor saw the whole story. She saw a husband's hand that had once reached for this book with love. She saw a father's hand that now recoiled from it in pain. Then, with a sound of pure, guttural frustration, he ripped the book from the shelf. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from the desk lamp. He turned, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. Rage, sorrow, and a flicker of something she could only describe as defeat. He did not walk back to her. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his presence overwhelming. He did not place the book in her waiting hands. He thrust it at her, hard. It struck her squarely in the chest, forcing a surprised gasp of air from her lungs. She stumbled back a step, her arms coming up instinctively to catch it. The book was heavy, solid. Its cloth cover was worn smooth at the edges. A single embossed silver star glinted in the dim light. "Take it," he bit out, his voice thick and strained. The 2 words were a surrender disguised as a command, an admission of failure wrapped in fury. He stood over her, breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his eyes. He looked like a man who had just torn out a piece of his own soul and thrown it at her feet. "Now get out!" The order was absolute, a dismissal from his world, from his pain, from his sight. There was nothing more to say. The battle was over. Eleanor clutched the book to her chest. She didn't dare look at his face again. She simply nodded, a small, jerky movement, and turned. Her legs felt unsteady as she walked the long distance to the door. Every step felt like an eternity. She could feel his eyes burning into her back, a silent, searing gaze. She reached the heavy oak door, her hand fumbling for the cold brass handle. She pulled it open and slipped out into the dimly lit hallway, not looking back. The library door slammed shut behind her. The sound was like a cannon shot, echoing through the silent, cavernous corridor of Ashworth Manor. The finality of it stole her breath. Eleanor leaned back against the cool wood of the door, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it felt like it might break free. She was shaking, a fine tremor running through her entire body. Alone in the hallway, she looked down at the prize she held clutched in her hands. Tales of the Northern Sky. It was just a book, but as she hugged it tighter to her chest, it felt like a shield. It felt like a key. It felt like a victory. The heavy oak door slammed shut, the sound echoing down the corridor like a thunderclap. For a long moment, Eleanor Vance did not move. She stood alone in the shadowed hallway of Ashworth Manor, her back pressed against the cold wall panels. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that seemed too loud in the oppressive quiet. In her hands, she clutched the book. It was heavy, solid, a tangible piece of victory wrested from the Duke's cold fury. The embossed silver star on the cloth cover felt cool against her trembling fingers. She had won. She had faced the Duke in his fortress of solitude and had not been broken. But the victory tasted of ash. His rage had not been simple anger. It was a raw, desperate pain she had provoked. She had seen it in the depths of his shadowed blue eyes, a grief so profound it had frozen him solid. And she had taken a hammer to the ice. A necessary cruelty, she told herself, her breath still coming in shallow bursts. She was here for Thomas, not to soothe the pride of his father. Straightening her shoulders, Eleanor pushed away from the wall. The library door remained a dark, imposing presence behind her, a closed chapter. Her purpose now lay at the other end of the hall, in the quiet nursery where a little boy was waiting. Her footsteps were hushed on the long runner carpeting the hallway. The portraits of Blackwood ancestors watched her pass, their painted eyes seeming to follow her with silent judgment. She ignored them. She had earned her place here tonight, not as a servant, but as a warrior for a child's lost voice. As she walked, she ran her thumb over the book's worn spine. It felt soft, loved. This was not merely a collection of stories. It was a vessel of memory, a direct line to a time when this house was filled with warmth, not suffocating silence. It was the key. When she reached the nursery, she paused outside the door, composing herself. She smoothed her dress and took a slow, deep breath, willing the tremor from her hands. She could not bring the tension of the library in with her. Thomas needed calm. He needed peace. He needed a story. She opened the door gently. The room was cast in the soft glow of a single lamp on the corner table, pushing back the encroaching twilight. Thomas sat on the floor, surrounded by his drawing papers. He looked up as she entered, his wide, sensitive eyes immediately falling on the large book in her arms. There was no surprise in his expression, only a quiet, unnerving watchfulness, as if he had been expecting it all along. Eleanor offered him a small, steady smile. She did not speak. Words felt clumsy, inadequate for the moment. Instead, she walked over to the worn armchair near the window, the one she always sat in when she read to him. She settled into the cushions, the old springs groaning softly. She placed the book in her lap, her hands resting on the cover for a moment. The silence in the room was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with a fragile, unspoken anticipation. Thomas remained on the floor, but he had turned his entire body to face her, his blank pages forgotten. She opened the book. A faint scent of dried lavender and old paper drifted up, a ghost of the woman who had held it last. The pages were thick and creamy, softened at the edges from countless turnings. Eleanor's gaze fell upon the elegant, looping handwriting on the inside cover. For my dearest Thomas, may you always find your own star to guide you. With all my love, Mama. A pang of sorrow, sharp and sudden, went through here. This was more intimate than she had imagined. She was not just reading a book. She was stepping into the sacred space between a mother and her child. Clearing her throat softly, she began to read. Her voice was low and even, a gentle current in the quiet room. She started with the first story, a tale of mischievous sprites who painted the colors of the sunset. She read about a grumpy giant who learned to laugh from a clever fox. With each word, she felt the tension in the room lessen. The stories were simple, timeless, but it was her voice weaving them into the air that was doing the work. It was filling the void that had been left by another's. Thomas did not move, but his gaze was locked on her face, his expression intense. He was not just listening, he was absorbing every syllable. After a few tales, Eleanor let her fingers drift through the pages. She was searching for something specific, a feeling she could not name. Her intuition, the same instinct that had guided her to the garden and then to the library, was telling her that one story held more power than the rest. Her fingers stopped on a page that was more worn than its neighbors, the corner gently folded down. The chapter heading read, The Star Follower's Son. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that this was it. This was the one. She took a breath and began the new tale. The story was about a young boy named Leo who lived in a kingdom of perpetual twilight. His world had lost its sun, and his heart had grown cold and heavy. But his mother had told him that if he was ever truly lost, he should find the brightest star in the northern sky and follow it. She promised it would always lead him home. Eleanor's voice was barely more than a whisper now, imbued with a tenderness that came from a place of deep empathy. She described the boy's lonely journey, his fear in the whispering woods, his doubt as the path grew dark. She described his small hand held up to the sky, searching for that single point of light. As she read, she felt a shift in the room. Thomas had crawled forward, inch by inch, until he was sitting on the rug near her feet. His head was tilted back, his eyes fixed on her. She could see the lamplight reflected in their dark depths. He was no longer a distant, silent statue. He was a little boy, lost inside a story that was his own. The boy in the book, Leo, finally saw his star. It shone with a brilliant, steady light, cutting through the gloom. He followed it over hills and through valleys, his hope growing with every step. Eleanor read the final lines. And when the boy arrived, he found not a castle of gold or a kingdom of riches. He found a small, warm cottage with a light in the window. He found home. She finished, and the silence that followed was profound. It was a silence that held a year of unspoken grief, a year of loneliness, a year of a small boy lost in a world that had gone dark. Eleanor's own heart ached. She did not dare to look down at him immediately. She kept her eyes on the page, the printed words blurring slightly. She felt as though she was holding her breath, waiting for the world to either shatter or mend. Then she heard a tiny sound. It was a small, hitched breath. Slowly she lowered her gaze. Thomas was looking directly at her. His face, which had been a pale, emotionless mask for so long, was alive with feeling. His brow was furrowed in concentration. His small hands were clenched into fists on his knees, and his lips, which she had never seen form a word, were trembling. He opened his mouth, then closed it. A battle was taking place within him, a struggle against the silence that had become his prison. His eyes welled with tears, a mirror of the unshed tears in her own. He tried again. A faint, raspy sound escaped. It was a ghost of a word, barely audible. He took one more shuddering breath, His entire body tensed with the effort. He looked from her face to the book in her lap and then back to her eyes. The word came, fragile and broken, yet clearer than any sound she had heard in this house. It was a whisper, a plea, a prayer. Again. The single word hung in the air, a miracle made of breath and sound. Eleanor's control broke. A tear slipped from her eye, then another, tracing silent paths down her cheeks. It was not a sound of sadness, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching relief. The dam of his silence had been broken, not by force or discipline, but by a story. By his mother's love, channeled through her. She couldn't speak. She could only numb a slow, jerky motion, her throat tight with emotion. She raised a hand to wipe her eyes, her fingers clumsy. Yes. Again. She would read it 1,000 times if he asked. At that exact moment, Mrs. Gable was making her final rounds of the evening. Her starched uniform was immaculate, her posture as rigid as ever. She walked down the corridor, her sensible shoes making no sound. Her duty was to ensure all was in order before the house was settled for the night. As she passed the nursery, she noticed the door was slightly ajar, a sliver of warm light spilling into the hallway. It was an untidy detail, one she would normally correct. She paused, intending to close it, when she heard the sound. A child's voice. It was faint, hoarse from disuse, but it was unmistakable. She froze, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Her mind refused to process what her ears had just heard. It was impossible. For 1 full year, there had been nothing, just an unnerving, heartbreaking silence from the nursery. She leaned closer, her stern expression melting into one of utter disbelief. She saw Eleanor in the armchair, her face wet with tears but shining with a joyous light. And at her feet she saw Thomas, the silent boy, looking up at his governess with an expression of pure, desperate hope. Mrs. Gable stood rooted to the spot, a statue carved from astonishment, the quiet order of her world completely and irrevocably shattered. For a full minute, Mrs. Gable did not move. She stood frozen in the nursery doorway. The single word, spoken in a voice she had not heard in over a year, seemed to hang in the air. Eleanor's soft, joyful sob was the only answer. Mrs. Gable's hand fell from the door jamb. She took one careful step back, pulling the door almost closed, leaving only a sliver of light in the corridor. Then she turned, her usual gliding walk gone. Her steps were short and urgent on the polished floors. Her mind, usually a fortress of schedules and inventories, was a storm. A whole year of silent meals. A year of doctors shaking their heads. A year of the Duke's deepening despair. All of it was undone by a governess he despised on sight. She did not slow as she reached the west wing. The heavy oak door to the Duke's library loomed before her. She raised a hand to knock, a habit of 4 decades. But her knuckles only grazed the wood. She turned the cold brass handle and pushed the door open. Alistair was standing by the hearth, staring into the flames. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat on the mantelpiece beside him. He turned his head slowly, his eyes filled with a cold fire at the interruption. His mouth opened to deliver a scalding reprimand. Mrs. Gable spoke first, her voice tight, stripped of all its usual deference. "Your Grace." Alistair's jaw tightened. He had never heard her use that tone. "The boy," she said, her breath catching. "Master Thomas." He spoke. Silence fell upon the room. Alistair stared at her, his expression unreadable, as if she were reporting a ghost. "What did you say?" he stated. Not a question, but a flat command. Mrs. Gable swallowed, her composure returning. Miss Vance was reading to him from the book. His mother's book. "I heard him. He said a word, Your Grace." Alistair placed his glass back on the mantel with a heavy click. He did not believe her. He could not. Hope was a more dangerous intruder than any governess. "He makes sounds," Alistair said, his voice clipped. "Murmurs. The doctors said it was involuntary." "It was not a murmur, Your Grace," she insisted, her gaze unwavering. "It was a word. It was clear." He searched her face for any sign of delusion and found none. He saw only the shocking certainty of a woman who had just witnessed a miracle. Without another word, he moved past her, out of the library and into the shadowed hall. He did not rush. Each footstep was measured, controlled. The walk of a man betraying nothing. But inside his chest, his heart hammered against his ribs. He was walking toward the scene of his greatest failure. He remembered Eleanor Vance's face in this very library, her clear gray eyes accusing him. He had called her insolent. He had told her his son's grief was not a game. And she had told him he was blind. The memory burned with a fresh shame. As he drew closer to the nursery, he heard it. A soft voice, weaving a story through the silence of the house. He stopped just before the doorway, hidden in the shadows where he could see. The door was ajar. Through the gap, he saw a scene that did not seem real. The room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of a single lamp. Eleanor Vance sat in a low armchair, the book with the silver star resting in her lap. And beside her, pressed against her side, was Thomas, his son, his silent, lost son. One small hand rested on the open page, his finger pointing to a drawing. Eleanor paused her reading. "That one?" she asked softly. "That is the huntsman's belt, 3 bright stars in a row." Alistair watched, frozen, as Thomas looked up at her. The boy's face, usually a pale mask, was alive with curiosity. His eyes, his mother's eyes, were wide and focused. He was not looking through her, but at her. He leaned his head against her arm, a gesture of simple, absolute trust. Alistair felt something inside him, a vast sheet of ice that had formed over his heart, begin to groan and crack. He had tried to command his son's healing. He had brought in experts who spoke of discipline. He had enforced a crushing silence, believing if he ignored the wound, it would scar over. He had been so terribly, arrogantly wrong. This woman, with her quiet defiance and simple stories, had not stormed his fortress. She had simply found the one small, forgotten gate he left unguarded, the memory of love. The gratitude that rose in him was sharp and painful, tangled with a profound, suffocating shame. He was grateful to her, and he was ashamed of himself. He backed away from the light, retreating into the darkness of the hall, but the image was burned into his mind. He saw the warmth and the trust in that room, a world he had locked out. And he finally understood he was the one who had been truly blind. Alistair Blackwood did not return to his library. He had stood frozen in the corridor, listening. From behind the nursery door came a sound he thought was lost forever. The quiet murmur of his son's voice and the patient answers of Eleanor Vance. The sound was not a comfort. It was a physical blow to his chest, the sudden return of something he had tried to bury. For a moment, he felt like a stranger wandering the echoing halls of his own life. Later, as twilight bled purple across the sky, Eleanor found a quiet moment in the walled garden. The day's victory had left her feeling strangely hollow and drained of all strength. She stood by a rosebush she had tended weeks ago, its leaves dark in the fading light. She ran a finger over a thorn, the sharp point a small, real pain that grounded her in the cool air. Footsteps on the gravel path made her body go rigid. She did not need to turn to know who it was. There was only one person whose presence could charge the air with such weight. Her heart, which had been slow and weary, began to race. She kept her back to him, braced for a cold reprimand, perhaps for succeeding where he had failed. Alistair stopped a few feet away. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. When she finally forced herself to turn, he was not the man who had furiously confronted her. The severe, unyielding mask was gone. In the soft, forgiving light of dusk, the lines around his eyes seemed less like marks of anger and more like traces of deep, enduring sorrow. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was no fire or ice. There was something else, something complex and raw. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice rough. The name on his lips sounded different. It was no longer the title of an employee, but the name of a person. She inclined her head slightly, her own pride a shield she held up. He had made nothing easy for her. He took a hesitant step closer, his gaze dropping to the rosebush between them. "This was my wife's favorite," he said, his voice quiet. "She planted it the year we were married. After she was gone, I couldn't bear to look at it." His confession hung in the air, fragile and painful. He looked back up at Eleanor, his eyes stark with a truth he had kept locked away. "I let everything she loved die. I thought if I erased the reminders, I could erase the pain." Eleanor's own defenses began to crumble. This was not the cold Duke of Ashworth. This was Alistair, a man drowning in his grief. Her throat felt tight. You can't erase love by destroying the things it touched, she said softly. You only create more emptiness. A sad, faint smile touched his lips, more painful than his anger. I am beginning to understand that. He looked toward the manor where a single light now shone from the nursery window. I stood outside the door. I heard him. He turned his full attention back to her, and the intensity of his gaze made it hard to breathe. I was wrong, he said then. He said. The simple words landed with incredible force. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about what my son needed. My pride and my grief made me a fool and a coward. He finally looked away, shame on his features. I was punishing him for reminding me of her. Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes, hot and sudden. She had battled his anger, but she had no defense against his broken honesty. All the resentment she had harbored toward him dissolved in that single, devastating admission. You were grieving, she whispered, her voice unsteady. Grief does not follow rules, Your Grace. Alistair, he corrected her, his voice low. He looked at her again, and the admiration in his eyes was unmistakable. He was seeing her for the first time. You did for my son what I was incapable of doing. You gave him back a piece of his mother. You gave him back his voice. He took another step, closing the small distance between them. I don't know how to thank you. Hearing him speak was all the thanks I needed, she replied, her voice gaining strength. The air between them was now charged with a different kind of energy, the quiet, powerful pull of a shared understanding. Instead of speaking more, he simply reached out. His fingers brushed against hers where her hand rested on the stone wall. It was a fleeting touch, barely there, but it sent a shock through Eleanor's entire body. It was not a gesture of authority. It was a simple human connection. His skin was warm. She did not pull away. In the gathering dark of the garden, they stood together in the quiet.